Is it hard for you to take a next step of faith when you don't know what's ahead? Hi, I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and if you enjoy hearing people's stories and want to be encouraged about the way God is working in their life, you found a home right here at the Parable Podcast. Joining me today is author of Choosing the Opposite and teaching pastor Tammy Melchein, who shares about her relational healing and embarking on a faith-filled adventure of next steps.
If you are actively and intentionally cultivating your intimacy with God, that's the only way that I ever trust those gut instincts. If you are walking that way with Him and sharing with people you trust, then you gotta just trust and take the step that He's calling you to take. It's scary to step out into the unknown. It's scary to leave the comfortable. You know, all you can do is ask God to show you the next step. In my experience, He rarely shows you the whole picture, but He shows you the next step. Take that step and trust that the next step is going to be illuminated, and then the step after that.
Here's my conversation with Tammy Melchein. Thrilled to introduce you to my friend Tammy. I have met Tammy a couple different times over the past couple of years, and I'd have to say, Tammy, you're one of my favorite people to learn from on how to be a better speaker. And
thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, we met at the Women's Speaker Collective, correct?
Yeah,
yes.
We met at Women's Speaker Collective. I feel there is exponential. I feel like I briefly met you there once, but yeah, and then there was a Story Strong retreat. And so I think it's maybe because I like you the most because your style of writing out and manuscripting is very similar to mine.
Yes.
And so I'm like, okay, somebody else does this and they understand like why to practice, why to manuscript. Because we were just talking before, like when we have to speak impromptu, like we can hear the words that we reuse. And that is why you are thankful we manuscript. So how long would you say that you have been speaking publicly? Was that something as a kid? I did a lot of like speech competitions as a kid, but is that something you grew up doing, or if that is something new within the last couple of years for yourself?
Actually, it's not something I really knew growing up that I was going to do. I think in some ways I think from a young age, I was identified as a leader. Mm-hmm. And so in most situations I was in, most organizations or teams I was a part of, I was a leader, which involved oftentimes getting up and saying something in front of people. But in terms of actually speaking, it's not something that I had much opportunity to do or even really thought that it was something I was supposed to be doing. Yeah. I mean, early on in my ministry career, I occasionally would get to teach like at a Wednesday night Bible study, maybe a couple times a year. But even I've been at the church I'm at for 23 years now, but even the first 12 years that I was here, I didn't do any upfront speaking outside of the ministry that I was leading at that time. It wasn't until I became a campus pastor that then I stepped into a regular teaching role. And so I was almost 40 before I realized, oh my goodness, I think that this is actually something that I'm created for, something that I'm gifted for, something that I'm good at. And so in some ways, I wonder what it would have been like if I knew that when I was 10. But I'm in some ways a late bloomer to having a speaking and teaching ministry.
Well, whether or not you're a late bloomer, I think you're fantastic. One of my favorite speakers to watch as well. You're just so engaging, and I love your storytelling. So your church is super blessed to have you. What would you say as we're heading towards the end of this year? What was your biggest goal that you had this year?
Well, my biggest goal was I was launching my first book. And so anytime you do something that you've never done before, I'm an Enneagram 5, which means I like to know all the information and you don't have the information. And so my biggest goal this year was just to honestly be faithful to do whatever I sensed that God wanted me to do to birth this book into the world. Because, I had already finished writing it and editing it last year, but this year was the year of getting the word out and marketing and all of that stuff. And so a lot of that doesn't come naturally to me. But I just leaned into it and wanted to be faithful to what God wanted me to do, and then just release and trust that he would do with the book whatever he wanted to do. Yeah. So in terms of professionally, that was my biggest goal this year.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing goal to have. It's just been exciting to watch you and your journey of what you said of wanting to know all of the ideas, all of everything that needs to go into it. That's hard when some of these things are unknown and you're just yeah, I'm working on this and just going into the world.
And even after it's launched, I still don't know what those things are. So, but you can only be faithful with what you do know and with the opportunities that God is putting in front of you. And so that was my goal. And I feel like by his grace, I feel like I can say I walked through it that way.
Well, you had talked about just kind of having this need to know all the details just for your personality. But where would you say, emotionally speaking, you feel the most safe in your life? It could be with people or a certain place?
Wow. And I'm an introvert. So when you ask me that, I think of both a place and a person. I think of, in terms of a place, I live alone and my house is sort of a sanctuary for me in that. And I've even had friends that have come over that they've told me when they walk in my house, it just feels like a very peaceful place. I think some of that is probably the way I really decorate. There's not any brightened colors or things like that. But also there's not a lot of clutter. And it feels like a place where my soul can breathe. And it's interesting to me that other people perceive that when they walk in there too. And so I feel like my house is a sanctuary for me. But I also, when you ask that, I'm blessed with some just wonderful friendships in my life and one friend in particular that if you have that person where you can just be fully yourself and, from the silly to the I'm crying and I don't know why to, every aspect of that is a place that I think those relationships are just a treasure from God. And for me, I'm blessed to have that in my life as well.
I absolutely agree with you on those people that are those safe people where you can show your full range of emotions.
They think of the best of you even when they probably shouldn't.
Yes.
They're not the person you go to for constructive criticism because they can't do that.
Yeah, that is true. I know a couple years ago, I was in a small group and there was this list of all these different types of personality traits or things that you can have within a relationship. And only Jesus can be all 12 of them. And in a friendships capacity, you're only going to have so many people. And I was having a conversation with our daughter who's 15, deciding what friend groups are a good friend group and which maybe are not and worth spending time in. And I tried to give a couple examples of my life. I'm this one person is I can truly be completely myself. I feel no judgment at all. And I agree. That is one of the safest places to be.
It's a gift when you have that in your life. Yes,
absolutely. On the opposite side of safe is, and really kind of probably a little bit of some of the premise of your book is, why do you think people say mean things to others from your perspective?
There's probably multiple reasons, but one thing that does come to my mind is we're usually, a lot of times when we lash out, we're speaking out of our own pain. And so it's hard to remember that when you're the recipient of the angry words or the harsh words or the insensitive words. But usually behind that, there is some kind of pain, which might be, the hurt that they've received, or perhaps it's a feeling of low self-esteem. And, lashing out kind of gives you a feeling of power over others where you might feel powerless. And so usually I think we do that out of pain. I know for myself, again, I'm not a lash outer. I'm not a person that is very verbal in that way. I'm a steward. And so I have to think more about what happens inside of me than necessarily the words that I'm speaking. But I know when that anger is in me, and it's more like all the things I want to say, not the things that I actually do say, but all the things I want to say. I recognize that so many times if I peel back the layers from that, there is some pain or feeling of a loss of control or a hurt or something like that is driving my reactions to it. And so isn't it Jesus that says like the proverb, out of the heart, the mouth speaks? I think a lot of times it's if what is coming out is painful and hurtful, there's probably pain and hurt inside of us.
Oh, that's so good. And I think that's good to kind of recognize that when we talk about our own stories, when we are in relationship, friendship with other people. Gosh, that has helped me so many times. Not that I want to psychoanalyze every single person, but if I have an understanding of what someone's childhood was like, what season that they're in, not to say whatever they say to me, if it's mean, is acceptable, but I'm like, okay, I am walking into somewhat of an understanding of why this is happening.
And I mean, sometimes if I've done something, then I need to recognize that I may be the one that's causing the pain. That is that lashback. But a lot of times I think it's the way people lash out, especially on social media, you know, the way people lash out when half the time they don't even have relationships with these people. Yeah. That is a displaced anger, a displaced outrage that is coming from a different spot. And I think we would all do everyone well if we would all examine that in our own hearts and our own minds.
Well, Tammy, I'd love for you to share with us today one of your parable stories where God has taught you a lesson through a season of your own life.
When I thought about that, I thought all the way back to probably about 25 years ago is the story that I want to share, because it was such a formational story for me about trusting God and about what it looks like to take steps of faith when everything is unclear. And at the time, I was serving in campus ministry in Central Illinois, and I loved my job working with college students. I just loved it. But what was so hard for me during that season is in the small town and the campus ministry, we basically functioned as a church. So we had Sunday morning services, Wednesday night, that type of stuff. So I didn't really have a peer church community of my own. And when I started in my, early to mid 20s, that was okay. But as I got to be 30, then the only people in my life were still 18 to 22. And it was just it was just a time of loneliness and a longing for community. And I remember a friend of mine spoke into me at that time. She's like, I know you love what you're doing, but maybe it's time for you to think about what's next. And when she said that, something just released in me. And I knew that my season there was over. Yeah. And so I actually went to the leader of the ministry and told him, this was in December, that I knew this was my last year and I was going to resign effective at the end of the school year in May, but I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. And so it was one of the scariest times in my life, but yet just this faith-filled adventure as well. And so as I began praying about what God would have me do, I felt like I kept hearing Chicago. And I didn't, I'd never lived in the Chicago area. I'm from Cleveland originally. I really knew no one up here except for some alums from the campus ministry. But I just began to lean into that. And so I asked a guy that I knew who planted campus ministries if he knew of any church community in Chicago that was hiring. And he told me, well, I have a good friend of mine who has two brothers that planted this church in the Chicago area. Their names are Fergusons. And so whatever rudimentary search engine we had back then, I typed in Ferguson's Church, Chicago, and somehow came across this community Christian church. And so I sent the lead pastor at the time, Dave Ferguson, an email, and he wrote me back and said, well, tell me what your dream is. And I thought, I don't have a dream. I don't know what my dream is. But I told him, well, I love working with college students. I see you guys aren't doing anything with college student ministry or on college campuses in that area. Maybe I could come do college ministry. So long story short, for about 6 months, it was really more his assistant and I kept in touch. And I came up here and visited once, and I can't explain it, but I knew Community Christian Church, which is where I still am today. I knew this is where I was supposed to be. But the problem was there wasn't actually a paid job. And so after those 6 months, I had a meeting with Dave, and he said, like a phone call with Dave. And he said, listen, we would love for you to come start college ministry, but you'd have to raise your whole salary. And for me at that point, I was like, okay, I would be game for raising some of it, like even half of it. But I felt like I needed, both for practical, but also just for confirmation, I needed like the other half to come from the church that I was going to go to. And so I told Dave, I still think I'm supposed to be there. but maybe it's not now. And he responded, he said, well, we were going to invite you to come up and meet this weekend, but I understand if you can't. So I told him, well, there's one other church in the Chicago area, and I won't name it, but it was a big, well-known church that I thought, okay, well, maybe I can go there. And I had put in an application. And so I knew I had an application in that. So I called that church and I said, hey, if I came up this weekend, could I interview with you? And they said, sure. Yeah, sure. Come up. So I called Dave back. I said, hey, I'm going to do both of these things at the same time. So I still will come meet with you. So I drove up here, and I have to tell you, in the car ride up here, there was a part of me that was just so wrestling because I knew, I felt like, God, I know I'm supposed to be at community, but if I'm wrong about that, have I been wrong about everything? And again, I just felt like, okay, keep taking those steps. So I met with Dave and a few others here, and I loved it, and they loved me. But at the end of the day, I told them, listen, I think I'm supposed to be here, but it's just not now. And so I'm going to go to this other church and interview and figure out, and maybe in the future I'll be here. Now, again, I'm such a planner, so this is so unlike me, but I did not know where I was going to stay that night. And at this time, I did not have a cell phone. So one of the guys from community asked me, where are you staying tonight? And I'm like, I don't know. He goes, well, at least let us get you a hotel room. So they got me a hotel room in Plainfield. I drove to the other church, interviewed with them, and I knew instantly, this is not where I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be at community. So I'm driving back to this hotel, just deciding that I'm going to come up here and I'm going to get a job as an administrative assistant somewhere. And I'm just going to be a part of this church. And I walk into the hotel room. I put down my bag, and the phone in the hotel room rings. And I pick it up, and it's Dave's assistant. She says, listen, we've been talking. We do have one half-time role open. And if you'd agree to do it for a year and then raise your support to do the college ministry with the other half, we can get you here. I was like, well, what's the other job? And she said, children's ministry. And honestly, Danielle, I was like, oh, it's just not what I could imagine myself doing. But I talked to, I hung up the phone and I called a mentor, and they're like, listen, if you feel like God has you there and you're supposed to be there, it'd be better to be doing that than work some job somewhere else. And what it turned out to be too was the only person I actually knew at this church was the lead children's director, because he was the son of my secretary in campus ministry. And so I ended up joining the staff that way. And God, in his sense of humor, after I was here for a year, I ended up going full time in children's ministry because it was like a leadership challenge, but also the whole reason I left campus ministry was because I was longing for peer community. And I stepped into this ministry that was full of women my age. And I feel like, during that season, not only did God just bless me with the relational healing and filling that I needed, but also for 7 years, I wrote the curriculum for elementary large group. And so he was honing my writing and my teaching gifts until it was time for me to step into all of that. And so that story is almost a beginning microcosm of how much of my journey in ministry has gone, that it's like you just take the next step, even though everything is unclear, but then God has purposes and plans that there's no way you could possibly have seen, but you just learn to trust him. And in hindsight, it just creates this beautiful picture where you see he was active in every piece of it. Yeah. So that's the story that I wanted to share. And I could repeat that pattern in other things, but that was the time when I feel like I really learned just to walk by faith. And even though so much did not seem what I was expecting it to be.
Tammy, I think so many of us can resonate with that story because we want to know what the next steps are. And then also that challenge of deciding of you loved what you were doing with college ministry, but to have finally that sense of permission from a friend to say it's okay to move on. That's hard when we love places where we're at. What would you say for somebody who feels like they're at that point in their life where they just kind of need somebody to say it's okay to, even though we don't know the next steps, how would you encourage them in that?
The biggest thing for me in that season was, and really every season is, if you are actively and intentionally cultivating your intimacy with God, that's the only way that I ever trust those gut instincts. And so, if you are walking that way with him and sharing with people you trust, then you got to just trust and take the step that he's calling you to take. And I think so many times, and there are other times where I know in my gut and I shrink back from it, and it takes me a while until I finally give in, because I think a lot of us do that too, right? Like we actually know, but it's scary. It's scary to step out into the unknown. It's scary to leave the comfortable. And so all you can do is ask God to show you the next step. And in my experience, he rarely shows you the whole picture, but he shows you the next step. And then take that step and trust that the next step is going to be illuminated. And then the step after that and the step after that. And it's not that it's always going to be, some of the steps I've taken when I have followed what I thought God was doing, and it's led into some of the hardest seasons of my life too. It's not always that everything works out really good. But again, even walking through some of those hardest seasons of my life and walking through the hardest seasons of your lives, I think you still will look back if you were following the lead of what you think God wanted you to do, you will look back and see how he was working his plans and purposes in your life in ways that might have been painful at the time, but now you can look back on with gratitude for what they formed in you.
I have this friend that when we have this idea of a decision to make or which path do we take, there's like this sense of being frozen, if you will, because you're like, what if I take this and is then God not going to follow provision? God's provision is anywhere. And so just to have that also permission too, to say there could be multiple options, but God is still going to be walking with you, and he's in every one. I think that gives us a sense of relief in that way too, where there's no like perfect journey that like this is the only way, and if you haven't followed it, well, then you suck. Because
I don't think that. I think for all of us there are multiple things we can be doing, and as long as we're doing them keeping in step with the Spirit as best we can, what God wants to do is do. I don't think God like has this, there's exact plan. And if you don't follow it to the letter of the law, you're not going to end up where I wanted you. I don't think God operates that way. I think he does lead us, but I think the opportunity is usually much wider and much more grace-filled than we realize.
Tammy, I really liked how you said when you were looking and longing for community, that you said once you stepped into that children's ministry, that the people that you met there, it was relationally healing. And I think there's probably a lot of people out there that don't realize that they do need healing in relationship only because of maybe things that have been broken in the past, or they're missing significant human relationship. Something that when we have safe people in our life that provides us that place that we can be ourselves and also challenges us to just be better in our own walk with God. Your thoughts on that?
I assume our listeners are people that want to follow Jesus and want to be transformed more into his likeness. I don't think it's possible to do that in a vacuum. I think we have to be in relationship, not only because of what can't happen in us, but I don't think we can live out the way of Jesus without pouring ourselves out for others. And so you're right. So much of our culture is shaped around individualism and, doing it on my own, kind of looking out for me. But again, that is the antithesis of what we see in the book of Acts. That is the antithesis of the love your neighbor and the do to others that Jesus taught us. And so I don't think that we can fully become ourselves. We can't fully become who God created us to be without connecting ourselves into meaningful relationships where not only are we receiving, where we are also really giving. And so I think, I've heard a lot of people talk about, especially as you grow older, how it's hard to find those kind of things, but we have to like figure that out in our lives. And that's where, I sometimes will say, I've lived, I don't know about you, Danielle, but I've lived my whole life connected in church community. And I honestly don't understand where I would be without that. And for a lot of people now, and I understand some of the reasons, whether, it's church hurt, relational hurt, whatever. A lot of people kind of say, well, no, I still follow Jesus, but I don't want to be part of the church. And I just don't know that that is actually a path to actually become who God created you to be. And so it might look different than the form of church that you were a part of before, but you have to take that step to get connected in some kind of community in order to be fully human. And the reality is that when you take that step, you are going to experience more hurt, more pain, but it's also the door to healing and to love and to belonging and to community. Yeah. And so I guess my encouragement to people would be just to be brave and take that step.
I mean, that leads us right into your book, Tammy. When we have relationships, it's bumpy. People are sinful. People are dealing with past things. And so you wrote the book, Choosing the Opposite, How the Sermon on the Mount Helps Us Rethink Our Assumptions, Recalibrate Our Instincts, and Rediscover the Way of Jesus. Tammy, when you chose the Sermon on the Mount, was there something, that's one of those stories in the Bible that comes out multiple times a year in a message. So what did you learn from the Sermon on the Mount that was like, oh, I never realized this before?
Yeah, probably the part of it that I think my understanding of deepened was the whole section where, it starts with Jesus saying, talking about unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And then it's the 6, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you, sections. You're familiar with that, what I'm talking about? Yeah. It's in chapter 5 there. That really what I think Jesus is doing there is he's telling us that unless we learn to live out his scriptures in a way that is just radically loving, we're not really following him in his kingdom way. Because the Pharisees, who he's comparing us to there in Matthew 5:17-20, they actually were really good at following the letter of the law. But what was void in them was love for other people. And so then when Jesus says something like, you have heard that it was said, do not murder, but I tell you, anyone that's angry, what he's saying is, yeah, okay, it's great if you didn't murder anyone today, but that's a pretty low bar of what following him in his kingdom way is. Yeah. He's trying to get more at the deeper things in us and say, but look at the way that you murder people through your anger. And that's what needs to be rid out of you. When he says, like, you have heard that it was said, keep your oaths, but I tell you, let your yes be yes, no be no. He's saying, like, learn how to love people in a way that you can so authentically, like, you're not twisting your words. You're not trying to manipulate anyone. You're just authentically truthful. Because that is the best way that you can love people. So all of these things, it made me realize what I think he's trying to do. There's a lot of things he's doing in the sermon, but one of these things in these very relational sections is he's trying to show us a whole different way of relating to one another that is the opposite of the way most people are relating. And this all came to a head to me, over the last 5 or 10 years. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has experienced a lot of angst and the fear and the anger and the division and the polarization, how it's just worn us all out. And sadly, one of the things I realized was, as followers of Jesus, we don't really look much different than the rest of the world when it comes to this. And it made me take a step back and just go, okay, if the way that we are relating to one another, to our neighbors, to the people we disagree with, is not bringing more of the kingdom of God from heaven to earth, then we need to take a time out. Yeah. And we need to, as the subtitle says, rethink our assumptions and our instincts and realize that there is a better way of relating to one another. And that's what I think Jesus is trying to teach us in the sermon.
So true, Tammy. There will always be some kind of topic that will have a polarization effect. There's always, just wait another news cycle, there will always be another topic that will be polarizing. Like, this will be the reality of our world here on this earth.
But it's such an opportunity, though, too.
Yes.
It's such a, that's the thing. It's like, yes, there will always be another cycle. And if we continue just to jump in the fray with everyone, then we're just going to continue to feel all we're feeling. But as Christ followers in the way of Jesus, like, imagine how different it would be if we actually loved our enemies. And we actually prayed for those who persecuted us. We actually turned the other cheek. We actually did what we'd want done to us. I mean, I think that would, in this polarized climate, that would be something strikingly different. And people would notice. Yeah. People would see.
That's so good, Tammy. To know like what our opportunity is at. What is our next step? You know, when we think about our life, when we are having coffee with a friend or we are around the dinner table with our extended family, you know, sometimes these topics can just like literally come out of nowhere. For me, I'm a person that like, I feel like I just need to have facts. But I also come out of the same vein of what you're just sharing is like, what would Jesus do in that moment? How can I listen to you? How can I love you? How can I really try not to make assumptions in this setting and also keep my tone really chill? So what would be your encouragement? Because we're all going to walk through this, like, and to help us have this mindset of like, how can we be countercultural? How can we continue to choose the opposite? What would be one of your tips from your book that you could share?
I mean, for one thing, you have to choose that you're going to choose the opposite before you find yourself in that situation. I mean, what you just said is wise, to know that we are going to be in these situations. And oftentimes, if we wait to choose our reaction until we're actually in the situation, it's really hard. And so you actually have to, I think, decide that you're going to go into these encounters with a certain posture. One of the things that I think in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most confusing verses in the sermon is the one about do not throw your pearls to pigs. And I always wondered what in the world is, you know, and why is Jesus calling people pigs and dogs? That doesn't seem right. And it wasn't until I read Dallas Willard's interpretation, his thoughts on that passage, that it just came alive to me. He suggests that what Jesus is doing in that section is he's not calling people pigs or dogs. What he's saying is that the problem with throwing pearls to pigs is that the pig is not able to digest them. And what he draws this kind of connection is a lot of times when we find ourselves in these disagreements or arguments or just situations, we want to throw pearls of wisdom, and we might be right with what we're saying, but we're throwing these pearls to people who are not able to digest them. And therefore, they're not helped. And Dallas Willard would say, it's no wonder then that eventually they get angry and, as the verse says, they turn and they tear you to pieces. Yeah. And so in some of these situations, if you realize, okay, you know, especially if it's, let's say it's a family member and you have clashed over a political issue. Well, you know, if that topic comes up, that other person is not going to be in a position to hear your great wisdom. Right? Yeah. So don't throw the pearl, and instead maybe take the posture. In fact, right after that pearls and pigs is where Jesus says, ask, seek, knock. And like, you know, a lot of scholars think he's talking about prayer there, and he might be, but it's also that section is in the section of the sermon where he's talking about the planks in your eye, and it ends with do to others. And so maybe there's a relational angle on that instead of like coming in and assuming you know things, ask. You know, instead of just, you know, drawing your own conclusions, seek to understand where the other person is coming from. Instead of just looking for places to get your words in, knock on the door and ask, you know, like ask the other person's questions. Yeah. And what I think he might be doing there is like take this posture of curiosity. And so instead of throwing your pearls, just take a posture of curiosity. Try to understand where the other person is. And my guess is, you know, it's not going to happen overnight. But if you do that consistently, you might get to a point where the other person says, well, tell me what you think about it.
Yes.
And it could lead to a whole different place of connecting on that. And so I just think there's so much wisdom. You know, I mean, we didn't even talk about the planks and the specs. There's just so much wisdom. And I mean, even in that section, I mean, one brief thing I'll say about that is I think part of what God is doing with that, or what Jesus is doing with that plank and spec section, is he's freeing us from having the responsibility to play the role of judge. You know,
that's so good. Yeah.
Like, why is it that we think we need to be the ones to determine who is good and who is bad? You know, why is that? I mean, now I'm not saying like there are times that we need to have discernment. We need to know, okay, this is not a healthy relationship for me to be in. That can be discerning. But like, it seems to be that we have taken for granted that it's our job to throw people into the good bucket or the bad bucket. And Scripture's clear. There is one judge and it's not me. You know, and so why am I taking that responsibility on myself? And when you recognize that and you realize, okay, I'm not responsible for this person, I can entrust them to God, because ultimately they're going to answer to him just like I'm going to answer to him. And so I can stay, you know, like I can share my convictions with humility and respect, but ultimately I can just entrust that other person to God. It's not my burden to bear to kind of have a declaration on them. So I think there's even things like that we can free ourselves from this stuff that is just weighing all of us and drawing us all into this pit of angst and division and polarization that I think Jesus is trying to lead us out of.
I think that is a good mindset and helpful tool for all of us to really be thinking about, is just shifting our position of how can we be of not necessarily the judge, but a person that is more curious and open to conversation so we can build relationship. It's beautiful. Tammy, if people wanted to connect with you or grab your book, what would be the best way that they could do that?
Well, Choosing the Opposite is available on all platforms, so you can find it wherever you like to buy your books. And then I also do either a once or twice a month, I send out a newsletter with a devotional thought and some updates, sometimes book recommendations. So they could sign up for that at tammymelchein.com. And then I'm also on socials, on Facebook, Tammy Melchein, and on Instagram, Tam Melch. So I'd love to connect with people in those places.
Perfect. We'll put all of Tammy's information on today's show notes. Tammy Melchein, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Danielle.
Gosh, didn't you love the idea about what the throwing the pearls to the swine meant? That was so helpful to have that kind of context. We, I'm sure, have all had those moments where we can either choose curiosity or lash out in frustration. So Tammy's book, Choosing the Opposite, would be a great first step so we can choose in advance to live counterculturally in this world. If you want to connect with Tammy, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time together today. Number 1, why do you think people say mean things to others? I know Tammy gave her perspective, but do you agree? And is there a specific time that comes up for you where you can reflect back now with your own perspective? Number 2, is there a certain friend or family member that came to mind today? Is there a strain over that relationship? I'd love for you to pray right now for healing and the ability to choose the opposite. Could you do me a favor and share Tammy's episode with a friend or family member who maybe just is at a season of their life where they are feeling challenged in this idea of oppositeness? Thank you to my editor-in-chief of a husband, Eric Zapchenk. We hope you were encouraged to think about your own story. And remember, your parable showcases how God is in your next steps. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.